Okay, so the last point I want to make is in this introduction, is to make a difference between architectural history and history of architecture with a capital A. So ever since the Renaissance period, since the 15th century, architecture with a capital A has been developed. That is, architecture as a noble activity, intellectual activity, one of the three fine arts. It is something created by great genius, and it is grand, it is glorious. On one hand. On the other hand, they are just mere buildings. Those buildings are not considered architecture with a capital A, like this juxtaposition between the Golden Pavilion in Japan. That is great architecture, it's golden, it is elegant, it is expensive. While on the other hand, there are anonymous peasant house, those are vernacular, and those are buildings, not architecture. So this is a kind of popularized view about architecture. So to some extent, history of architecture refer to the history of those great monuments, while architectural history is look at history architecturally and try to pay attention to the entire built environment. And hopefully our class can be more architectural history instead of just a history of great monument of architecture with capital A. But it is not always easy to do that, because whatever came down to us are very often great monument. The reason is very simple, because common house built by common folks in the past, they were not meant to last very long, and they were built with temporary material, and they didn't last for 2,000 years for us to see, to study. So this is an unfortunate situation for the study of architectural history. We want to be more architectural history, but we often ended up with still history of architecture with a capital A, which just make us kind of a more, make those common architecture for common life more valuable, those discovered by archaeology. So we will pay attention to that, but you will notice in this class and in your textbook, still we rely greatly on those great monuments, great landmarks. So this is on one hand, there is a problem. So architectural history by no means cover the past, just like, you know, the documented history versus history as a collective entity happened in the past. They are different. Architectural history as documented, as being written in books or taught in courses, is different from the, you know, whatever the entire reality of the built environment in the past. So on one hand, there is a problem. On the other hand, there are certainly people who didn't see this as a problem. For example, Nietzsche, again, in his article on the use and abuse of history for life, he said, what is the use to the modern man of this monumental contemplation of the past, this preoccupation with the rare and the classic? It is the knowledge that the great things existed and was therefore possible, and so may be possible again. So for him, there is nothing wrong to just focus on great monument. There is nothing wrong about the history of architecture with a capital A. But you know, we can understand this position, but we do acknowledge the missing part. Right? There is a huge missing part. It is like living in Boston. You know, in the future, all people know about the 21st century Boston, you know, is the Capitol building or the Hancock building, you know, those designed by famous architect, as if the very house I'm living in has never existed. So of course we know this is wrong, right? It's very partial picture of our built environment. But unfortunately, this is exactly what we can do about architectural history, simply because, you know, small buildings, vernacular residential architectures didn't last as long as this great monument that is constructed by aristocracy, the priesthood, the military caste, the emperor, the king, the rich and powerful. So this is another kind of problem in the study of architectural history. And architectural history, you know, the quintessential monument for architectural history is something like this, like the Parthenon. And we will spend a lot of time on Parthenon simply because it is so famous and it is influential on a lot of governmental building in the United States for the 18th century to the 20th century. So it's a great monument, the Parthenon. And so today, the Parthenon is like that. However, if you look at an 18th century representation of the Parthenon, it is quite different. This is an 18th century print of Parthenon. And you notice that within the Parthenon, there is a mosque. And on top of the Acropolis, there is a whole town. There are small buildings which were constructed during the Middle Ages. You know, Parthenon was completed 2,500 years ago in the 5th century BCE. And then after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Acropolis on which Parthenon is standing was transformed into a church. And then after the Turks took Athens in the 15th century, they turned the small church into a mosque. And then when Greece got its independence in the 19th century, they chose to remember only the most glorious past in Greek history, and that is the 5th century BCE. So all the successive happenings to Parthenon were cleared. So those mosques, those small residential buildings were all erased to restore the purity of a 5th century BC architecture, right? So this is metaphorical for history writing. History writing is not only about remembering, it is also about forgetting. History is written in a way that only those selected, only those materials fit into a master narrative to glorify someone or some agenda are recorded, while the rest of them are forgotten and are erased intentionally. So this is also something we should be mindful in the study of history and in the study of architectural history, for sure. Critical to Nietzsche's position is Walter Benjamin. So he blamed the monumental, the glory, and the master construction of history to glorify something. He is also critical to the great monument. He said, whoever until this day emerges victorious marches in the triumphal procession in which today's rulers tread over those who are sprawled underfoot. The spoils are, as was ever the case, carried along in the triumphal procession. They are known as the cultural heritage. There has never been a document of culture which is not simultaneously one of barbarism. So he kind of direct our attention to those neglected, marginalized, and critical to the great celebration of cultural heritage, something like this, great cultural heritage. There is obviously a different side of it. For example, standing on the same ground as Parthenon is the Erechtheion. To its southern facade is attached a colonnade of caryatid, and these column in the form of a young lady, in the form of a human figure, is known as caryatid. So how did the word caryatid came into being? Vitruvius, the very insightful architect and theorist regarding the beginning of architecture, also had insightful observation on the meaning of caryatid. He said, he talked about the significance of history to architecture. He said, quote, for instance, suppose him to set up the marble statue of women in long robes called caryatids. He will give the following explanation to his questioner. Caria sided with the Persian enemies against Greece. Later, the Greeks, having gloriously won their freedom, declared war against the people of Caria. Caria was a city-state, just like Athens, like Sparta, Corinth, etc. So he said, quote, they took the town, killed the men, and carried off their wives. Hence, the architects of the time designed for public building statues of these women, placed so as to carry a load, in order that the sin and the punishment of the people of Caria might be known and handed down even to posterity. End quote. So these girls had been praised by architectural historian as being so graceful, being so at ease, holding up those weight as if those thick beams are weightless. And according to Vitruvius, they are more about punishment, and they are more about the glorification of the Greek victory over the Persians, something we will look at in detail in our lecture on Greek architecture. So I want us to be mindful of, when we study these great monuments, we are mindful that there are something that we consider primitive, yet they waste no energy, they are more sustainable, and they certainly didn't last many thousand years, but they live with nature more friendly. And we will try to highlight that aspect thanks to the discoveries in archaeology. We sometimes has fragments of the past, which are residential architecture, not those great monuments. When those materials are available, we will introduce in class as much as possible, in addition to those great lineage of great landmarks. So just one last example of those ephemeral architecture. These are not architecture with capital A. These are not great landmarks, but they are nonetheless, to me, great architecture. For example, the igloo of the Eskimos. They built this kind of ice house, and which left zero footprint on the environment. They also are remarkable in terms of the environmental performance. In the harsh winter of the Arctic region, when the outside degree is -40, and the inside could be 59. And that is very comfortable. And they are constructed with packed ice, basically. And whenever they move on to a different location, they left their house, and their house will be returned to nature. And that kind of architecture, of course, had no position in architectural, in the history of architecture with a capital A. Nonetheless, they are great architecture that might be pointing to a brighter future of the environment on Earth with the current kind of crisis of climate and global warming, etc. So I think on that note, I will finish the lecture.